All right, we are now ready for Michael Sullivan to give us lesson number 2. As I pointed out, if you followed his development of the type and the antitype of the marriage, the divorce and the remarriage, the betrothal and remarriage of God and Israel in the New Testament, once you grasp that concept, New Testament eschatology, in just one more example, becomes rich and full and exciting. Welcome with me and for me, Mike.
All right, we got the clicker. Oh, here we go. I found it. All right. Lecture number 2. We're going to be dealing with the problems for postmillennialism in the Olivet Discourse. Subject matter is going to be the following. We're going to look at the Olivet Discourse as a microcosm of New Testament eschatology. And this poses a problem for postmillennialism. Number 2, the context and the questions of the disciple and the structure. There's a chiasm, how do you say that? Chiasm, and an inclusio between Matthew 23 and Matthew 25. And it's also recapitulatory. This creates a problem for postmillennialism. How the various views within postmillennialism and Reformed eschatology in general, again, form full preterism in the Olivet Discourse. Then we're going to spend specific. I don't want to go over a whole bunch of stuff that we already agree with them on, like the decreation language, the stars falling, the signs being fulfilled. That's just kind of a waste of time. So we're going to focus on the disciples' question and the end of the age, the Great Commission, is it one or are there two? Gentry's statement that all Old Testament prophecy was fulfilled by AD 70. The coming of Christ to gather the elect and give redemption in Luke 21, 27, 28, and Matthew 24, 30, and 31. Is that the resurrection, or is that a post-AD 70 evangelism? Something that the postmillennials try to avoid. Also, is there any soteriological aspects to Christ's coming in AD 70? Or was it just a physical deliverance? We want to look at division theories. We want to look at the order of Luke 17. Heaven and earth passing away. That's a big deal. I've noticed with Church of Christ. I have one experience with Church of Christ, okay? And that's my father-in-law. And, man, we had it out on a lot of things. But, and he's a preacher in the Church of Christ. But when it came to the Olivet Discourse, I just assumed he wouldn't take the end of the age, the Old Covenant age. He said it was the Old Covenant age. I said, wow, this is over in a heartbeat. This is great. But then, heaven and earth. So, we want to deal with that for sure. The day and hour, and the long time versus this generation. Does that mean that the Olivet Discourse can be divided into two different comings? And then, after I use Gary DeMar to refute Kenneth Gentry, and I show how both of those guys alone, without using amillennialism, forms full preterism in the Olivet Discourse, I'm going to try and critique, if I have time, Gary DeMar's assertion that the book of Revelation is John's version of the Olivet Discourse, and his admission, as far as I know, that Daniel 12 was the resurrection. And I'm going to tie that into the millennium of Revelation 20. So that's a brief overview and roadmap where I'm going to try to go here. Now, a lot of people are like, oh my goodness, the Olivet Discourse, you preterists, that's all you talk about, this generation, blah, 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 blah. But I don't care who says that. Church of Christ, premillennial dispensationalists, amillennials, postmillennialists. You go and you say, find me your best theologian. Give me your best commentary. I'll read it, and I guarantee you, 99% of the time, they're going to admit whatever's in the Olivet Discourse is going to dictate the rest of your eschatology. Your understanding of prophecy in general. Let's look at some quotes. Kim Riddlebacher is an all-millennialist. He says, how one interprets this important text will go a long way in determining one's view of the millennial age, which obviously he's not putting us in there. And that's true, it will determine your millennial view. After citing scholars that concede Paul in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and John in the book of Revelation are following Jesus' teaching in the Olivet Discourse, D.A. Carson writes this: we may say that Jesus himself, in the Olivet Discourse, sets the pattern for the church's eschatology. Gary DeMar, I already quoted this, says John's version of the Olivet Discourse is the book of Revelation. Well, that's very interesting once we get to Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46, and look at Revelation 20 and Daniel 12. And this is the best quote I found from Thomas Ice, of all people. A proper understanding of the Olivet Discourse is absolutely essential for anyone who wants to gain a clear picture of God's plan for the ages. This discourse is so significant that the way a person interprets it will impact his understanding of the rest of the prophecy in the Bible. Whew. Very well said, Mr. Ice. It's too bad he butchers it. All right, so let's deal with this. How are postmillennialists dealing with this concept that the Olivet Discourse dictates the rest of your eschatology in the New Testament? I found this development very, very interesting. And Keith Matheson's not his first book, but in one of his books on dispensationalism, he does the standard division theory. But he affirms with the Westminster Confession of Faith and the rest of the creeds, that the Olivet Discourse does teach the doctrine of the second coming, the judgment, the new creation, and everything else. And he says, and therefore it's the same coming of the Lord as Acts 1:11, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4, Hebrews 9:28. But now there's a shift taking place before he publishes From Age to Age, when he's writing a refutation against us, which we responded to. And he throws out all kinds of views to try and make it confusing and so difficult that no one can understand. That's his problem. That's not ours. He says this. He says, and these two quotes are in footnotes. That's how embarrassing they are. And I want you to really think about the implications of what he's saying. This interpretation, that is that Matthew 24 and 25 is the one coming of the Lord in AD 70, doesn't deal with the second coming. It says this interpretation would mean, of course, that Jesus had very little to say about his actual second coming, but this should not be a major obstacle to evaluating the interpretation. And because he and Gary DeMar take this view, now Gentry, well, I don't see any problem with it, because my buddies are. I mean, it's no big deal, right? Oh, it's a real big deal. Then, full-blown, he takes the position in his own work. He says the bulk of the New Testament's teaching on the second coming would be found after the resurrection and ascension. Acts 1, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4, Hebrews 9:28. Again, in another footnote, because it's so embarrassing. Probably this is why we haven't heard from the authors of When Shall These Things Be in 8 years. The all-millennialists on the side that wrote in this book are like, you're kidding me? You're taking both Matthew 24 and 25 as AD 70? You're saying the resurrection of Daniel 12 was in AD 70? You guys are leading everyone to full preterism. That's what they're saying behind doors. I can guarantee you that. All right, so you ever take a test in high school or college and the teacher messes up on the test? My daughter's in college and she's given me a couple of examples of this where they have to redo it and redo the grades and everything. But the question is, which is true, A or B? And you're thinking to yourself, I think there's something wrong with this test because there should be C that says both A and B are true, right? And that's where we are in eschatology right now when it comes to the Olivet Discourse. A standard amillennialist, my version at least, the ones that I come in contact with the most, not the partial preterist ones, is Jesus' one second coming in Matthew 24 and 25 is and forms the New Testament teaching on his second coming in Acts 1, 1 Corinthians 15, Hebrews, and 1 Thessalonians. We agree with that. Got no problem with that. That is absolutely accurate. And to try and bind my conscience and tell me I'm a heretic for believing A? Why? It's orthodox. Well, what about B? Jesus' coming in Matthew 24 and 25 was fulfilled spiritually in AD 70. And here's a quote from Gary DeMar, and refers to nothing else. Not the end of world history. I agree with that. Thank you, Gary DeMar, for at least making this orthodox. I appreciate you being a stepping stone for us. I wish you'd kind of be a little bit more than that, but he has made that position orthodox. Thank you. So why bind my conscience and tell me I'm a heretic for believing that? Now, G.K. Beale comes along, and he says the coming of Christ in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 is the coming of Matthew 24. And he makes all the parallels that we do, and I'll do later. But now he's trying to do like R.T. France and say, well, maybe the coming of Matthew 24:30 was AD 70. But then he says, oh, but I got chapter 25. But he agrees. He says, this is a thorny problem. So I've got this puzzle here, right? We have C. We've got the right answer. We fixed the thorny problem that Beale has. We did the work for him. It's in 90% of all of Don's books, all back there. But you have to think a little bit outside the box to make this puzzle piece work, don't you? See how the blue piece is kind of outside the box? Ever hear that phrase? You have to think outside the box sometimes to solve a problem. Well, what's the problem? The problem's the creeds, right? That's the box that the second coming has to be physical. The second coming has to involve the end of world history. And the second coming has to involve a physical, biological resurrection. We solve it, but in order to solve it, you have to revise the creeds. Not many men are willing to do that. Not many men have the courage to say, I'm going to stand for the truth, and I'm going to teach it, and I'm going to trust God for my finances. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of those. I believe over time we'll get there. We're like David's army in the wilderness, just being persecuted for now, but our day will come, I guarantee it. All right, so the context, the questions, and the formation of Matthew 23 and 24. There's a book, I haven't gotten it yet, but it's by a Roman Catholic. I'll take truth wherever it is, all right, even if it's a Roman Catholic. But he is proposing that there is a chiasm. Why am I having a hard time saying that? I didn't have, or an inclusio between Matthew 23 and Matthew 25. And he develops it. And it starts out in Matthew 23 with pronouncing woes upon the Pharisees. You sit in Moses' seat, and you hypocritically judge these people. And then you go through Matthew 24, you end it in Matthew 25. But I'm the Son of Man, and I'm going to sit on the throne, and I'm going to judge you, you hypocrites. So it comes full circle. And it's dealing with one coming of Christ in the Old Covenant age. But you can see the one that I've developed. And in an inclusio, or this kind of a structure, it starts with something that's very important. It can be a trigger, it can be a word, it can be a phrase, it can be a subject matter. And then it goes A, B, B, and they're parallel, and then it goes back to where we started. Don knows this, I'm sure you do too. Whenever Jesus used that phrase, verily I say unto you, man, he's nailing home the point. And so we start this in Matthew 23, where there's a persecution coming, and it's the vindication of the martyrs. This is the judgment of the living and the dead. Then it ends in Matthew 23 with him coming to destroy the temple, but I like what Don has to say about this, because it's the song of ascension. He's hinting at, he's giving them a sign. It's going to happen during one of your feast days. And we know from Josephus that it did. So now, in the middle here, we're going to start right there, right where Matthew 23 leaves off. And we start talking about his coming and the temple's destruction and the end of the age. And the issue of signs is now further developing. And then it ends, with the prediction of the persecution and vindication and the resurrection of the living and dead. That's what the gathering of the elect is in this generation. And then Matthew 24, verse 35, into Matthew 25 is what we call recapitulation. It's not a different coming. It's the same coming, but because it's a Jewish audience, more parables are thrown in. I mean, this is just kind of basic hermeneutical stuff that I think most see, but you have to kind of read different authors to find it. Now, Gary DeMar hits this on the head. Now, you ever do any bow and arrow work? If you're off just a tiny bit in your aim, by the time that arrow, it can be several feet off. If you don't get the disciples' question right, if you don't get what age this is talking about, you will miss the Olivet Discourse. And if you miss the Olivet Discourse, like I pointed out, you miss Bible prophecy altogether. That's why everyone says the Olivet Discourse is the first thing you read from anybody. And you say, oh, it's so difficult. It's not difficult at all. Here's John Murray, one of Gary DeMar's favorite theologians. He's an amillennialist. The Olivet Discourse, as to structure, is recapitulatory. It is not, therefore, continuously progressive. We are repeatedly brought to the advent and informed of its various features, contemporary, concurrent, or interrelated events and consequences. Now notice verse 14, the gospel preached in all the world, and then the end of what? The end of the age that they just talked about. The gathering of the elect, and then the coming of the Son of Man in chapter 25, verse 31 following. Now, the weakness of his position here is that it comes to an end in verse 34, too. Yeah. Are we? No? Yes. 2.3. There we go. Sorry. We come to a conclusion in verse 34 as well, and he's not pointing that out. Why? Because he doesn't know how to deal with this generation if you read him. So he doesn't want to admit that, because then he would be saying all these climaxes are dealing with this generation. But what he's saying about the layout, the general layout of recapitulation, is actually accurate. Now, the view of John Murray and Gary DeMar actually form our position. And I wanted to read something here about Gary DeMar's comment. This is taken out in his other editions, Don. I don't know if you've seen this. But look in the middle of that paragraph. He says, these questions are related to the destruction of the temple and the end of the Old Covenant redemptive system and nothing else. Now go down to what's underlined in the next one. It's about the end of the Old Covenant and the consummation of the New Covenant. It's taken out of some of the other editions. Wow, boy, I'm sorry, guys. I'm really trying to get the hang of this. It's a little... Okay, do you see that very bottom, what's underlined? The Olivet Discourse is dealing with the consummation of the New Covenant, not the inauguration. That's pretty interesting. And I think I understand why he took that out of his other editions. Because as Don was pointing out in Romans 11, the consummation, what brings the forgiveness of sins? It's the New Covenant. It is when the New Covenant is matured, that's when forgiveness of sin comes. So obviously, the Olivet Discourse is dealing with soteriological issues. Sorry, guys. Okay. So here's Kenneth Gentry. His position on the end of the age is very confusing. He says, Christ's teaching here is extremely important to redemptive history. He's responding to the question of the disciples regarding when the end of the age, Greek aeon, will occur. Great. In essence, his full answer is when the Romans lay waste the temple. Okay, further develop this for us. The change of the age is finalized and sealed at the destruction of Jerusalem. And of course, he goes to Mark 9:1. So if the coming of Christ in Matthew 24 and Mark 9:1 is AD 70, and it marks the change of an age, well, what age changed? It was the Old Covenant age into the New. That seems to be a contradiction to me. But he wants to toe the line, got to fall in line with the creeds, and he ends up holding hands with Tommy Ice and tuliping through the tulips on this unfortunate agreement. In these questions, we sense, well, maybe you sense it, I don't, once again, the bewilderment among the disciples at Jesus' teaching, a bewilderment such as is seen elsewhere in Matthew, as in their confusion about the leaven of the Pharisees, Christ's death, the purpose of the transfiguration, children, the nature of the kingdom service. Quite clearly, Christ divides their question into two episodes in his answer. One, he speaks about the coming tribulation resulting in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, which is this generation. And two, his distant future second coming at the end of world history, end of the age, which is after a long time. So let's deal with this. Basically, he's saying the disciples were confused to associate his coming with the destruction of the temple and the end of the age. Jesus allegedly teaches two different comings spanning thousands of years in Matthew 24 and 25, while apparently Mark and Luke didn't get this memo or irresponsibly forgot this important information and only record one AD 70 coming in their parallel accounts. I would think that's a major problem. So who's really confused? Is it Gentry or is it the disciples? Argument number one. Contextually, the temple's destruction, the temple that they're looking at and its destruction marks the end of what age? What does the temple have anything to do with the Christian age? It doesn't. Contextually, it's the Old Covenant age. And we know that because the New Covenant age has no end. Daniel 2, 44, 6, 26, 7, 14, and 18, Isaiah 7, 9, Luke 1, 32, Ephesians 3, 20, and 21. It's an age without end, or a world without end. Argument number two. Contextually, Jesus in verse 14 identifies the end of the age as simply the end. And if you read Daniel 9, the 77s, and also Daniel 12, even Daniel and the angel interlock the time of the end, the hour of the end, with just the end. All right? And it's the same end, it's just described differently. So this is a problem for Gentry because he takes verse 14 as fulfilled in AD 70. Therefore, he would have to say that the discourse is about the end of the Old Covenant age. Argument number three, and I already mentioned this, the parallel accounts do not record the end of the age, which is appears to be a Jewish phrase because only Matthew uses it. And again, Matthew throws in the extra parables because of the Jewish audience. So there's not really a problem with that at all. Argument number four, Old Testament references. Jesus is drawing from Daniel 7, 9, and 12 in the Olivet Discourse, where the end of the age is described as the time of the end. Argument number five, Gentry proves too much. When he appeals to these other passages in Matthew where the disciples are confused, number one, the text tells you they're confused, or it informs you that Jesus is going to correct their understanding. So Gentry, when he cites these, he proves our point. If that's the case, then we should expect that in Matthew 24. Do we see it? No. You proved way too much. Thank you. Here's a chart that Don produced in The Living Presence and then was later put in his book on the Great Commission. He points out how every Greek word that Jesus uses to describe the Great Commission The Apostle Paul uses those exact Greek words and puts it in the past tense and says it has been fulfilled. And thus he has an imminent expectation of the resurrection of the dead and the second coming. But our postmillennial friends have to have another great commission to support their postmillennialism, and so they hold out on Matthew 28 and mostly Acts 1:8. But notice, well, let me go through this. Let's point out why this is a problem. Okay, and the gospel must first be published among all nations, Greek ethnos. Fulfillment, my gospel has been made manifest, and the prophetic scriptures has been made known to all nations, ethnos. Partial preterist postmillennialist agrees. Nations here was fulfilled by this passage. But what about Matthew 28? We have ethnos as well. And why can't we apply Romans 16, 25, and 26 to that? And what about the end of the age? The postmillennialist, Gary DeMar, has already told us the end of the age, and Joel McDorman, it's only used 3 times in Matthew 13, Matthew 24, and here. Based upon what hermeneutical rules are you now switching that this end of the age is somehow the end of world history, when you just told us the other two are the end of the Old Covenant age? Oh, you have to support the creeds in your system, not because it's in the text. A few things on this real quick. All nations here, we know that the Jews were gathered at Pentecost, and 3,000 were saved, and it says that Jews from every nation under heaven were gathered. All right, they stayed some time with the church in Jerusalem. They got discipled by Peter. Then through the Holy Spirit and a persecution coming, they were sent back out into those nations under heaven, and they in turn evangelized the nations and discipled the nations. This is not that complicated. What about this phrase, Christ would be with them through the charismata? What is this with? I'm thankful for Don on this, because I heard him just give a one-sentence blurb in a debate, and I had to follow up on it because it sounded so good. But Mark's gospel closes in a similar way as Matthew's. There's an appeal to fulfill the Great Commission and encouragement that the Lord would be with them. I believe the context of Mark 16:15, especially verse 20, explains how God was going to be with the disciples in Matthew 18:20. Mark's account reads, "And he said to them, Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, and these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak in new tongues." Then in Mark 16:20 it says this, we are told, "Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it." Acts 10:38 talks about God was with Jesus because of the miracles he was performing. And then, Don, you were right, in Acts 14:15, the same concept is there. We talked about the end of the age being inconsistent for them. Well, here's another inconsistency. What about Acts 1:8? Postmillennials believe that Romans 10:18 proves the Great Commission of Matthew 24:14 was fulfilled by AD 70 because Paul uses the same Greek word oikumene, and the word carries with it a definition that is the then known world, or the Roman Empire. Yet Romans 10:18 also uses the Greek word gi, which also carries with it the meaning of a local then known world, or the Roman Empire. Am I at the right one? 3:1? Nope. Okay. So really, there's no reason why gi cannot be applied to Acts 1:8. Again, the hermeneutic is inconsistent and it's arbitrary. Gary DeMar even he follows Ogden in his commentary on Revelation. He says that the Great Commission can also be found in Revelation 14:6. And again, you have gi, you have the angel flying and the Great Commission going forth. Again, it's to every nation. Ethnos, you got gi, and then again, Romans 10:18. Why can't Acts 1:8, or why can't this passage fulfill 1:8? And if you follow the book of Acts, you will see that there are really 4 Pentecosts. You will see this unfolding and being fulfilled. Acts 2, for the Jews, my witness is in Jerusalem. Acts 8, the Samaritans and Samaria. Acts 10, the God-fearers in all Judea. And Acts 19, the Gentiles to the ends of the Roman Empire. So this poses some problems for postmillennialists, because Gentry writes prolifically, I don't know about prolifically, on the subject of prophecy and refuting some Reformed guys that are charismatics. And I'll be debating Michael Brown on this subject November 15th at Calvary Chapel. I think it's Charlotte or Raleigh, I can't remember. But and this, when I was a charismatic, I used to go to this all the time. This was one of my main arguments. If the Great Commission has not been fulfilled, we need to be speaking in tongues. This is just, I don't know how you get around it. Look at the parallels between Acts 1 and the Olivet Discourse. Keith Matheson, connecting the Great Commission with the timing of the coming of Christ in Acts 1, writes this: the time frame of Christ's second coming is hinted at in the preceding context. The disciples are given a commission to be Christ's witness in Jerusalem and in Judea, Samaria, and to the remotest parts of the earth. The implication is that Christ's second coming will follow the completion of the Great Commission here. Well, we proved that the Great Commission of 1:8. Why am I having a hard time with this today? 3:2. Oh, bless it. I'm sorry, guys. I am on 3:3. There we go. Sorry about that. So we have the same motifs in the Olivet Discourse that we have in Acts 1. Only the Father has the authority to know the day and the hour. Acts 1, only the Father has the authority to know the time and dates. Number 2, the Holy Spirit and the charismata would be given to boldly fulfill the Great Commission. The Holy Spirit, the charismata, would be given to boldly fulfill the Great Commission. Jesus would come from heaven upon his glory cloud in their generation, and the same thing is in Acts. It's the glory cloud. That's the point. So it's the same event. This is the time of punishment, Luke tells us, in fulfillment of all that has been written. I think William Bell really likes this particular passage. Gentry writes of this text, Jesus is referring to all things in the Old Testament. But in the same book, he affirms that the resurrection and judgment of Daniel 12 was fulfilled spiritually in AD 70. Proposition number 1. Jesus is teaching that all things written is referring to all Old Testament prophecy. Gentry and full preterists agree. Proposition number 2. But Jesus is referring to Daniel 7 and the resurrection and end of Daniel 12 and the resurrection gathering of Isaiah 25 and 27 in Matthew 24 and 25. And these are Old Testament prophecies. All millennials would agree with that, and we agree with them. Conclusion: if we combine the two, Jesus in the Olivet Discourse taught that his second coming, arrival of his kingdom, judgment and resurrection of Daniel 7:12, Isaiah 25 and 27 would be fulfilled at Israel's end in AD 70. Again, here's a chart. I'm going to fly through this. The Olivet Discourse compared to Daniel 7 and 12. Okay, in the Reformed Study Bible that R.C. Sproul and Keith Matheson are editors, we read this of Matthew 24 and 30 and 31, the gathering of the elect. But the language of Matthew 24:31 is parallel. Now, your Church of Christ critics are saying, well, you're just using similar language, right? They're allowed to use similar language when they want to, but when you do it, it's just eisegesis, right? We get the same thing from the Reformed community. So he says, is parallel to passages like the end of the age gathering of the elect in the parable of the sower or the weeds, Matthew 16, 27, 28, Matthew 25. These are all passages that Gary DeMar says was fulfilled in AD 70, and 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4. John Murray, in appealing to the analogy of faith principle of interpretation, says the same thing. Oh, man, what a drag. Okay. Well, here are the parallels that postmillennialists make between 2 Thessalonians and Matthew 24. It's important, again, for them to get rid of all that negative stuff so they can support their postmillennialism. So they make parallels between the Olivet Discourse and Thessalonians. Gary DeMar does the same thing in chapter 5 of Thessalonians 5. But notice he only does 2 parallels, Christ coming like a thief and birth pains, in his book. The reason he doesn't develop all 7 or 8 of these is because he's too close to 1 Thessalonians 4, and if he does that, then we're getting into 1 Thessalonians 4, Matthew 24 territory, and that's why I believe he conveniently stopped there. All right, again, I put together a logical argument. I'm going to pass that for now. You guys are more than welcome to look at that later. Okay, again, here's the chart. We all know it. We all love it. Tony didn't help me put this together. To meet the Lord in the air, and Don has done a great job on this, is a technical term which is referring to a dignitary, or it's the groom coming for the bride. And again, this is getting us back to the resurrection and the wedding feast of Isaiah 25 and the gathering of Isaiah 27. This is the thorny problem that G.K. Bill is talking about. Again, now the parallels between 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, which everyone agrees on. And then Matthew 24 is equal to 1 Corinthians 15. As Daniel has pointed out, the end there is the same end. It's the end of the Old Covenant age. Other parallels. What about the redemption of Luke 21? We've got on record in the Reformation Study Bible that the redemption, I'm just going to bypass this, the redemption of Luke 21, 27, 28 at the second coming is the redemption of Romans 8, 23, the redemption of the body. And it's also the salvation that was at hand in Romans 13, 11, and 12. All right, so these are soteriological passages that deal with redemption. I want to get to this. Here we go. Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, and Luke 17 forms the foundation for Paul's teaching in Romans 8. Look at all these parallels. There's suffering to come. There's present suffering. There's the kingdom would be realized within. All right. It deals with the redemption of the body, resurrection, gathering the elect, birth pains, childbirth, heavens and earth pass away, the creation of men groaning. Now, what about admissions from postmillennialists? John Lightfoot and John Gill and some other Reformed theologians come to the creation, the katasis in Romans 8. And they say, you know what? This does not have anything to do with the physical planet. This is the same creation that Paul preached to in Colossians. He preached to every creature under heaven. It's a creation of men. It's got nothing to do with planet Earth. And the decay is not dealing with the second law of thermodynamics. It's referring to man's sinful nature, and the groanings are the creation of men. Thank you. That's our view. Gary DeMar says, and he follows the Young's Literal Translation, he says, well, this was a glory that was about to be revealed in them. He gives that one sentence in his book, and he says, I don't know what it is. What do you mean you don't know what it is? The context tells you what it is. It's the liberation of creation, groaning. It's the adoption of sons. It is the redemption of the body, Gary. Come on. The division theories, oh man, I just don't. I'm going to go through these. Heaven and earth will pass away. G.K. Bill says heaven and earth in the Old Testament may sometimes be a way of referring to Jerusalem or its temple. What's the topic of the Olivet Discourse? It is the destruction of the temple and the end of the Old Covenant age. I cite some other scholars here saying the exact same thing. This generation and that day, there is, he uses day and days, plural, interchangeably. There's no argument there. this generation in a long time. Gary DeMar says he agrees with full preterists, and he says a long time in those passages are still within the lifetime of the people in the parable. There's no justification for saying the long time there means thousands and thousands of years, and he cites some other New Testament passages to support that. Dealt with that. Signs versus no signs. The second section is supposed to not deal with signs. That's baloney. Well, he's kind of done with that subject, but when he tells them to be watchful, obviously it's to be watchful about the signs that they were just talking about. And when Noah was building an ark, I'm pretty sure that was a sign. And then I'm going to close with this. Gotcha. I'm sorry. Critiquing Gary DeMar. I'll be done in 1 or 2 minutes. Sorry. Okay. Having spent some time allowing Gary DeMar critique Gentry and form our position, what about Gary DeMar? Gary DeMar claims that the book of Revelation is John's version of the Olivet Discourse, and he doesn't divide up the discourse. But yet, look at this. 80-70 is Matthew 24 and 25, but look at Revelation 25 through 15. The resurrection and judgment, decreation, the passing of heaven and earth, decreation, passing of heaven and earth. Christ on a throne to judge, God's on the throne to judge, and in Revelation, Christ is also on the throne to judge. Wicked along with the devil, eternally punished, same thing in Revelation 20. If you don't divide the Olivet Discourse, the millennium was between 80-30 and 80-70. If you say that the end of the Old Covenant age and the parable of the wheat and tares was 80-70, the end of the Old Covenant age, you just said that the millennium was between 80-30 to 80-70. And that's why Gary North told everyone that to believe that the parable of the wheat and the tares is 80-70 goes against orthodoxy, because he sees the train coming. And folks, these men, this is the line, they're stepping on it. They stepped over it, and they're wondering if anyone noticed. Don and I have noticed. And those books out over there prove it. So that's my case. When I write on this subject, I don't quote Don, I don't quote William, I just quote these guys. These guys do a great enough job making our case. So let's let them keep doing it. Let's pray real quick. Lord, thank you so much for the blessing of this conference and the fellowship and your word. Lord, I know it got a little awkward with this PowerPoint and the slides, but I hope that your word is out there and it's making an impact in people's lives. Lord, I pray for Gary DeMar. I pray for Kenneth Gentry. I pray for these men, Lord. I know it's difficult. I'm not in their shoes. And I know that their faith is being tested. And I know, Lord, that if there's any ignorance, if there's anything that they need intellectually to really push them over, I pray that you'd give it to them if they haven't had it already. But if this is a courage issue and this is a faith issue, Lord, strengthen their faith as you strengthen the disciples' faith. In Jesus' name, amen.
There was a lot of information there, and you should have been able to see very powerfully, very graphically, how the Olivet Discourse does, in fact, control our eschatological understanding of the rest of the New Testament. Guess what? Kenneth Gentry has been on record all these years of dividing the Olivet Discourse, saying it's critical. It's critical to understand that division. And yet, I don't remember the specific source. I've got it in my data file. Be able to get it for anyone that wishes the specific reference. Kenneth Gentry is now on record as saying, well, there may be some question now as to whether or not the Olivet Discourse is actually a united discourse. And that really doesn't matter, because even if it is united, that would not substantively affect our view of eschatology. The very first time I read that, I put the book back on my desk, sat there, kind of stared off into space, picked it up again, and yeah, it still said that. I was literally stunned. But you can see this kind of transformation that has taken place in Kenneth Gentry's writings, in which he will very subtly give ground to the full preterist paradigm, all the while slapping us beside the head as heretics and not informing his readers that he has just made an amazingly fatal admission. And I could stand here just like Mike did and just chronicle one change after another that Kenneth Gentry has made, giving ground to the full preterist paradigm. That's enough said on that.